Spending months building something you're proud of, only to have your first impression become the one thing you wish people forgot. Today I want to talk about Chimptopia from the perspective of someone who's an indie show creator themselves, and take a look at what went wrong. The creator of Chimptopia, Robert Pagliaro, is an animator you might recognize from working on Jack's Toy produced by Jake Neutron. But that brings us to the elephant in the room and something we need to address. At one point, Robbie had a piece in his portfolio that he created for Nick Fuentes. And for those who don't know, Nick Fuentes is a far-right political commentator and highly controversial public figure. Robbie later tweeted that he wasn't aware of how controversial the project was at the time because the internship had been offered through a family member and that he only learned about the brand's motives afterwards. That said, once those motives became clear, it does raise a question of why the piece remained prominently displayed in his portfolio for so long. To his credit, after receiving criticism, he did eventually remove it. Now this brings us to the teaser that ended up becoming the main reason Chimptopia was brought into the public spotlight. Robbie posted a teaser where the characters spend the scene mocking and insulting Gobbles from Gameoverse, a series created by Robert Ross. Ross is one of the most beloved animators on YouTube, and Gameoverse is something he's been developing ever since 2009. For many longtime fans, it's not just another indie project, but a series they watched grow alongside him for years and genuinely care about. So seeing another indie creator, someone working in the same space, use that character as a punchline of a joke, which felt more mean-spirited than playful, understandably upset a lot of people. That's not to say that there is no room for criticism or parody, there absolutely is, but there is always a right time, a right place, and a right tone. The Chimptopia teaser didn't really hit any of those, unless we're talking about putting a nail in a coffin of its Kickstarter. That one definitely was a hit. And what made the situation even stranger was how the response to the criticism was handled afterward. Instead of simply acknowledging why people were upset and moving on, another animation was posted where Gobbles is shown hitting Robbie's character with a whip while he's supposedly apologizing. The problem is that it doesn't really feel like an apology. It feels like the joke never actually ended. Instead of acknowledging why people were upset, the response turned the criticism itself into another punchline. And that's where my biggest issue with this whole situation comes in. This goes beyond one teaser or one bad joke. It raises a bigger question about how indie creators treat each other. The internet already has more than enough negativity. AI is everywhere, people throw around words like slop every other sentence, and every week it feels like creators are finding new ways to tear each other down instead of building each other up. Especially when you're an indie creator trying to build something without the backing of the major studio, you'd think that there would be more understanding between people chasing the same dream. And that's where I think the biggest lesson is. As an indie creator, your first impression matters more than ever. People aren't going to read your Kickstarter page, your character bios, or your production notes before forming an opinion. They're going to judge your project by the first thing that you choose to show them. Chimptopia spent months, maybe years being developed, but for many people their introduction wasn't the world, the characters, or the story. It was a controversy involving another creator's work. The teaser succeeded at getting attention, but attention isn't always valuable if it introduces your project for the wrong reasons. But putting the controversy aside for a moment, what actually is Chimptopia? According to Robbie's Kickstarter description, Chimptopia is an animated sitcom about three friends who need money to avoid being evicted by their landlord Chimp. And honestly, as a premise, there is nothing inherently wrong with this. A group of friends getting into ridiculous situations while trying to solve everyday problems is a formula that has worked countless times before. So basically the regular show was dudes. Only problem is that the regular show already has dudes. The challenge with a familiar premise is that the idea itself is rarely enough. What makes a show stand out is the personality behind it. The characters, the writing, the world, and the specific perspective that makes people think, I haven't seen this version before. While looking through Chimptopia's Kickstarter, there was a question I kept coming back to. What is the thing only Chimptopia can offer? If you removed the title and showed someone the description, what would immediately tell them this could only be Chimptopia and not another internet animated sitcom? Chimptopia seems to lean heavily into a classic sitcom dynamic. Robbie is the overly optimistic one who follows Nolan's bad ideas, Nolan is the reckless troublemaker constantly chasing shortcuts, and Waffles is the exhausted voice of reason trying to keep everything together. Now, these kinds of characters can absolutely work. Some of the most memorable animated shows are built around simple character dynamics. The issue isn't that these archetypes exist, it's what you do with them. And looking at the teaser, this is where I think Chimptopia struggles the most. Comedy is subjective, and a joke that doesn't work for one person might work perfectly for someone else, but even putting personal taste aside, comedy relies heavily on timing, pacing, and delivery, and the teaser often feels like it struggles with all three. The problem with the teaser is that many of the jokes seem to rely on the audience reacting to the randomness itself rather than building towards an actual punchline. Randomness can absolutely work in comedy, but randomness alone isn't a joke. Whether it's suddenly starting a song or throwing something for a shock reaction, the humor often feels more focused on, she's so crazy, I love her, rather than why is it actually funny. The biggest issue that the scene feels strangely slow for something that's only around a minute long. Not much happens, the pacing feels stretched out, and the moments that are supposed to be funny lose their impact because there is so much time between the setup and the payoff. And that's a pretty big problem when comedy is supposed to be the show's main strength. The teaser is meant to show us what makes Chimptopia funny, but instead the jokes often feel like they're struggling to land in the first place. And this is where I think having someone with a comedy writing background, or someone who is actually funny, could have helped. Comedy isn't just throwing random ideas at the wall and hoping one sticks. Timing, pacing, and knowing when a joke has actually earned its punchline are what makes comedy work. When your teaser is only around a minute long, every joke you choose to include matters. So when the teaser itself feels boring and the pilot storyboard you show off relies on a character repeatedly making the same crude joke about a liquid being mistaken for something else, it makes you wonder if it was really the strongest example of what the show has to offer. I also won't spend too much time talking about the voice acting, because that's more of a complicated topic, but the delivery in the teaser often feels restrained. It almost feels like everyone is trying not to wake up their mom in the next room instead of performing for an animated cartoon. This is especially unfortunate because the indie animation space is full of talented voice actors who would bring a lot of energy and personality to those roles. Because at the end of the day, a teaser has one job: convince people to support your project. It's the first impression. And if the thing that's meant to sell your show is the thing that makes people lose interest, then you have a much bigger problem than just a bad joke. And now we need to talk about what I think are the biggest offenders in Chimptopia: the character designs. Going back to the point I made earlier, when you're creating something with a familiar premise, you need something that immediately makes people go, okay, this is different. Characters are usually the first thing audiences connect with, and unfortunately the designs of Chimptopia don't do much to separate themselves. You have three dudes, and then you have a guy who is kinda dude and kinda monkey. Sure. Character design is more than just making something look cool. A good design should communicate who a character is before they even say a word. Their personality, interests, attitude, and their role in the story should be reflected through things like their shape, language, colors, silhouettes. But with Chimptopia, the designs often feel very visually similar. The silhouettes don't immediately stand apart, the color choices don't strongly communicate personality, and there isn't much that tells you who these characters are at the glance. Which is surprising because Robbie clearly knows how to draw. So the question becomes, what happened here? Why do we have the same dude in different fonts 3 times? Take a character of Robbie, for example. We are told he's cheerful, optimistic, and someone who believes everything will work out. But looking at his design, what tells me that? What detail shows his interests, personality, or the way he sees the world? These characters feel like self-inserts, and from what I gathered they are, but even a self-insert character still needs to feel like a character. Real people aren't blank templates. Everyone has something that influences how they dress, how they present themselves, and what makes them memorable. You don't need to turn every character into a magical girl or a Genshin Impact design covered in million details, but you also don't want them to feel like the most visually neutral person imaginable, because when you combine these designs with the teaser, another problem appears. The Kickstarter descriptions tell us who these characters are supposed to be, but the visuals and writing don't communicate that. We are told that Robbie is a kind and cheerful guy, but the teaser doesn't really make that clear. There isn't enough visual personality or distinction between the character to immediately understand who they are. But then there's Chimp. And oh boy, I know a lot of people have already talked about this character, so I don't want to repeat every point that has already been made, but there is a bigger world building question here. Why is the show called Chimptopia? Is this world supposed to be filled with monkeys, or is the name only referring to the landlord character? Because if Chimp is the only chimp in the world of otherwise normal-looking characters, that creates a lot of questions. Where are the other chimps? What does this say about the world? And why is this the character choice for the ruthless landlord whose main role is to take money from the protagonists? There are already conversations around the implications of this character, and while I can't speak for how other people feel about it, I do think this is a situation where more thought could have gone into the concept and design. Sometimes a character can unintentionally communicate ideas that the creator never intended, which is why these decisions require extra consideration. At the end of the day, character design isn't just about making something visually appealing, it's about storytelling. A great design tells you who someone is before they even open their mouth. It creates curiosity, personality, and memorability. And unfortunately with Chimptopia, the designs often feel like they are waiting for the writing to do all the work. But when the visuals and the writing aren't communicating the same thing, the audience is left trying to figure out who these characters are instead of becoming interested in them. There is one more thing I wanted to touch on, and that's the original Kickstarter stretch goals. When the campaign had the pre-launch page, the funding goals raised a lot of eyebrows. The base goal was around 10k, but then the stretch goal suddenly jumped to around 50k for a second episode, and eventually around 150 for the third one. Looking at those numbers, it's hard not to ask, where is all of this money actually going? And that's important because a Kickstarter isn't just asking people to believe in your idea, it's asking them to trust your plan for bringing that idea to life. Backers aren't paying for what already exists, they are supporting what you promise to create next. Animation is expensive, and many people underestimate how much time and resources even a short episode can require. The problem isn't the cost itself, it's whether the budget feels realistic and clearly explained. When funding goals don't seem to match the scope of the project, people naturally start wondering how those numbers were decided. A Kickstarter budget should feel like it was carefully planned. You want backers to understand why you're asking for a certain amount, what that money is paying for, and why each stretch goal costs what it does. When the numbers suddenly jump dramatically without much explanation, it can make the campaign feel less like a production budget and more like someone finding out how to spam motherload in real life. One of the most important parts of preparing a Kickstarter is researching projects that have already succeeded. Look at shows with similar scope. How large were their teams? What did they budget for? How did they structure their stretch goals? You don't copy them, but you learn from them. To Robbie's credit, these stretch goals were later adjusted. From what I've seen, they are now much more reasonable, with each additional episode increasing the funding goal by around 10k instead of making a huge jump. Considering the team is relatively small, that feels much easier to understand. The irony is that Chimptopia spent months being developed, but for those people, the first thing they learned about it had nothing to do with Chimptopia itself. It was a controversy involving someone else's show. That's an incredibly difficult first impression to recover from. I think Robbie made a lot of choices that hurt the project before people even had the chance to see what Chimptopia was actually trying to be. What might have seemed funny in his head ended up making a fun of a creator and a project that many people genuinely cared about. And while negativity will always attract more attention online, attention alone isn't valuable if it gives people the wrong impression of what you're trying to create. The internet already has more than enough negativity. Instead of spending time making a teaser that would throw the project into controversy speedrun, that effort could have gone into improving the comedy, strengthening the character designs, refining the writing, and giving people a reason to support the show. You know, the things you're usually supposed to do when you're asking people to fund your project. At the end of the day, I hope Robbie takes this as an opportunity to improve. There has been a lot of criticism surrounding Chimptopia, and whether he chooses to learn from it, it's entirely up to him. But the difference between a project people forget and one people genuinely love often comes down to being willing to listen, reflect, and keep improving. Because getting people to look at your project is the easy part. Making them remember it for the right reasons is the hard part. That said, I hope we can all learn from the mistakes of others. Making an indie project is difficult, and every creator is going to make decisions they look back on differently. The important part is being willing to listen, learn, and improve. Speaking of indie projects, I am actually working on my own animated series called Public Access Purgatory, which will be launching its Kickstarter this September. If you want to learn more about PAP and follow along before the Kickstarter launches, you can check out our Kickstarter pre-launch page. We'd love to have you join us before the station opens.